Again, good to see everyone. We are going to be talking about the parable of the talents. And let's just begin by reading the account, if I can, perhaps. Well, maybe I can, maybe I can't. There we go. Let's see. So we're in Matthew chapter 25. Matthew 25 at verse 14, it says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling to a far country, who called his own servants and delivered his goods to them. And to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his own ability. And immediately he went on a journey. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them, and made another 5 talents. And likewise uh, he who had received 2 gained 2 more also. But he who had received 1 went and dug in the ground and hid his Lord's money. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with him. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I've gained 5 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You are faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. He also, who had received 2 talents, came and said, Lord, you delivered to me 2 talents. Look, I've gained 2 more talents besides them. His Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. Then he who had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there you have what is yours. But his Lord answered and said, You wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents, for to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Okay, we may read the other one or at least look at the other one as we go along. I hope you already did look at the other one in Luke, the parable of the Minas, because there's something in that parable that speaks to the first question tonight. Our first question is, how do these parables tie into what comes previously? And they're not exactly the same, and actually, chronological Bibles put these 2 parables in 2 different places, at least some of them. But you can tell there's a similar lesson in both of them. And so the question is, how do the parables tie into what comes previously? Anybody have any insight into that?
Can I venture to say that in Matthew, the parable of the 10 virgins, is that what you're talking about? Okay, and the
Yes.
talents, it's showing that we need to be prepared for the bridegroom and for the master's coming.
And you don't know when it's going to be.
Right.
And I tell you what, I'll go ahead and put it up on the screen. Luke's actually puts it here. Let me make it. Luke's specifically concerning this parable. Give me a second. In Luke chapter 19, I want you to see what prefaces it. It says, Now as they heard these things, he spoke another parable because he was near Jerusalem and because they thought the kingdom of God would appear immediately. And therefore he said a certain nobleman went into a far country. So that is what I was wanting y'all to see, that it pertains to the Lord's return, and you don't know when it's going to be. And so that idea of preparation, that idea of being busy, of course, with the parable of the virgins, there they are, they're just waiting. But here it's like you better get busy because you don't know when the Lord's going to return and call for the accounting as it is. So anyway, that's one of, and especially in Luke's account, if I ask the question, what is the main point of the parable? that has to be one of the main points because that's the reason the Lord told the parable. Because there were some who thought he was coming back immediately. It's like, nope, that's not how this works. Okay. So now on to question two. And question two is the big question. And it's how are the parables different from one another? And there are definitely differences, and it's more than just the amounts involved. How are the parables different from each other? Like I said, we didn't read the Minas, but as I said, I hope you did.
John,
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
Matthew does not talk about the man traveling to receive the kingdom,
Okay.
but Luke does.
Okay. So it's a little bit of a different scenario. What other, and as we go through, I'll ask, is there any significance to some of these differences? For example, with the parable of the talents, the one talent man, he digs and he hides it in the ground. With the minas, he puts it in a handkerchief and hides it in a handkerchief. Is there any significance to that? I don't know other than hiding, concealing. The point is he didn't use it. But it is a difference. But there are other more significant differences. Anyone have any others they wanted to point out? Go ahead, Mark.
Well, just the difference, it seems the talents, it looks like there's three servants, and then the minas, it looks like there's 10 servants. And then
Okay.
the amount of the money was, a talent was a lot more. I mean, those are differences, not that it necessarily the lesson changes.
Let's go ahead and talk about that. So in Luke's account, says he called 10 of his servants and delivered to them 10 minas. So we're not just dealing with the different amounts, we're also dealing with the talents. And I keep having to go back and forth. So with the talents, he gives to one five, to another two, and to another one, each according to their ability. But with the minas, he gives the same amount to each one. And so that difference, you might think about the talents, like, yes, the different servants had different abilities, but at the same time, in a sense, we're all given the same thing. We all get the seed. We all get the seed. We all get the kingdom. It's what will we do with it is the question. So with the talents, yes, there's different abilities. With minas, it's the same. With the minas, one fella, he's given one, the talents, the five talent man comes back, says, I've made five more. The two talent man comes back, I says, I made 10 or made two more. With the minas, this one servant comes back and says, I've made 10, I believe. Yeah, let's see. With the minas, the first came and said, your mina has earned 10 minas. Now, you start looking at percentages, and that's a pretty good percentage. For one to go five talents to five talents, it's like, okay, you doubled your money. For one to go one mina to 10 minas, that's quite a bit more. Um, anyway, at least more percentage wise. And then the five mina man, or the other fella, he only got one mina, but he made five minas. And then, of course, you have the third one and such things as that. So you might think about different applications there. So the five talent man and the two talent man. It's real tempting to say that they both worked equally as hard because they both made 100% profit, right? The five talent man made five talents, the two talent man made two talents. But then you have two individuals, one made 10 minas worth of profit, and the other one made five minas worth of profit. And the Lord was pleased with both. I will say, when it's all said and done and you start getting into differences, and I tell you what, let me go ahead and put it up on the screen. The minas, I would suggest we're not as familiar with the minas, so maybe I should have read that one. But look in the mina. All right, so, and we'll come back to verse 14 because that's where the big difference is. But when you come down to the end of the account, or towards the end, verse 23, why then did you not put my money in the bank, that at my coming I might have collected it with interest? That's common with both. He said to those who stood by, take the mina from him and give it to him who has 10 minas. But they said to him in verse 25, that this does not appear in the talents. They said to him, Master, he has 10 minas. And then you have his response, for I say to you that everyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. That is in the talents. But that business about, they said, but he has 10 minas. I think it would be tempting to say, it's like, well, why don't you spread the wealth evenly? Why don't you give, why don't you give the mina that you're taking from this individual? It's like the 10 mina guy, he's got 10 minas. Give it to the 5 mina guy. So then the question is, why give it to the 10 mina guy?
It's rewarded.
Anyone have any thoughts on that? Because the servants have some issues with it. So why would you give it to the 10 mina person?
He seemed to have the most talent because of how he made it. He seemed to be the individual that knew what he was doing, and he went out for the master and he made a lot more.
Whoever has, how does it phrase it? To everyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. I would suggest even we do the same thing. If you have if you have two investments and one's making more than the other, what are you going to put more money in?
Sure.
Now that mentality, so you have, and if you're faithful over much, it's about growth. It's about growth. And so you have the 10 mina man, the man who made 10, and he says, give it to him. Everyone who has, everyone, I keep hashing it up, that to everyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. And anyway, it's up to the Lord what to do with it. I think in the end, because the question is going to come up, what's it all about? And it's about being busy doing the Lord's work, and it's also about growing. And it's, if you'll be faithful in a little, what does the Lord entrust to you? He entrusts more.
More.
Now, if you won't be faithful in the little things, why would the Lord ever entrust you with other things? That was actually one of the lessons of the unjust steward. Let's see, I actually wrote it down. That's Luke 16 at verse 11, where he says, why would I entrust you with true riches? And that, you have that idea. So anyway, let me put it back on the screen because we need to look at the big difference. Because the big difference is spoken about, if I can get my brain to work. Okay, back to the top of the parable of Luke's. A certain nobleman goes into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom in return. He calls 10 of his servants, delivered to them 10 minas, and said to them, do business till I come. And this is the part that's not in the talents. But his citizens hated him and sent a delegation after him, saying, we will not have this man to reign over us. So it was that when he returned, having received the kingdom, he commanded these servants, and you have the calling to account. So then you have the first and the second and the third. And then at the end, he says, for I say to you, everyone who has will be given, verse 26. And then you have verse 27. But bring here those enemies of mine who did not want me to reign over them and slay them before me. That element is not in the parable of the talents. So I won't even ask what it's talking about. I think it's pretty obvious what it's talking about. Those Jews who did not recognize Jesus, they did not recognize the authority of Jesus, and they did not want the authority of Jesus. When Jesus cleanses the temple and they say, "Who gave you the authority to do these things?" He
Mhm.
says, "My Father's house, you'll not make it a house of merchandise." They did not want his authority. They didn't want any part of his authority. They rejected his authority. So when you get to Acts 2, and it's this Jesus whom you crucified, God has made both Lord and Christ. 3,000 people respected his authority. The vast majority rejected it. And that's what the parable is about. You had those who said, "We do not want you reigning over us." And at the end, the man calls him and says, "Slay him before me." So that's one way that the parables are different. Any other differences you wanted to point out? Yeah, go
In
ahead, Brenda.
in Matthew's account, it talks about the one servant that was the lazy one.
Mm-hmm.
And hold on. He was cast into the outer darkness, which is similar. He was disobedient and he doesn't get to profit from anything.
Right. I was just reading how Luke's is just, Luke's doesn't really mention that, does it? Luke's, it just goes straight from take the mina from him, give it to him who has 10 minas. And then you have the summary somewhat in verse 26, and then verse 27 it moves on to the bring here those enemies of mine. So, yep, that's another difference. What else might you add? Any other differences? And there, like I said, some of them may be a little nitpicky, but there are differences throughout, and there may be significance to some of them. The the next question I had was one of the commonalities between the two. The one talent person, the one mina, he says, "Why didn't you at least give it to the bankers?" Now, what may that signify? Why didn't you why didn't you give
John,
it to the bankers?
John,
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
um, I believe it means that he should have, that shows a little bit of initiative. At least he would have got something for his efforts.
Okay. At least something.
Mhm.
It's like the absolute least you can do.
Mhm.
Now, I guess the bottom line is, let me rephrase that. The least that would have been acceptable because he kind of did the least he could do, which is nothing. You can't do less than nothing. Um, it's sad that this sort of thing actually happens. It's happened in our country in days gone by. I think it happens in other countries more often. In other countries where their banking system is in shambles, and it's like people don't put money in the banks in some places, because they risk losing it. So lo and behold, what do they do with it sometimes? They dig a hole and they bury it.
Mhm.
If you've ever known someone who went through the Great Depression, guess what some of them did? It's like it was not unheard of to hear of folks bearing money. And I'm not saying that that was right or wrong. I mean,
Right.
when the when the banking system fails, anyway. Um, but we hear that it's like, oh, why would you do that? And
Mhm.
it's like, well, people have been known to do it before. And as
Mhm.
we think spiritually, the point is you better get busy. You gotta better get busy and do something. Go ahead, Brenda.
Do you think it could also signify us letting others help us to do better with our lives?
I have that down in my list, and I just thought I would mention it. I know folks, and I somewhat take the view. What are he gives it to the servants, and he says, "Go and trade with it." Well, what do the bankers do? The bankers professionally trade with it. And so you're entrusting it to someone else. And so I've heard the application made actually talking about, okay, you may not be able to teach or preach someone, but can you support someone else who can teach or preach someone? And at the very least, you should do that. At the very least, you should do that. Um, and so, anyway, I do think that's an application. Any other thoughts on that question? I had a couple other questions I actually didn't put on the paper. What do you think? I was thinking about, and just give me your thoughts on this one. There's a great temptation, and I think you can talk about it from these parables, especially the parable of the talents,
Mhm.
because he gives to each one based on their ability.
Mhm.
Now, does he know their ability?
Sure.
Obviously so.
Mhm.
Now, there's a temptation to go two different ways.
Mhm.
One temptation is it a temptation to over exaggerate our abilities? You know, do is it possible to think we're five talent individuals when the reality is we're not?
Sure.
And where that comes into play is when you're dealing with others and you hope that you're working with a whole lot of five talent individuals,
Right. Mhm.
but that may not be the reality.
Mhm.
And that's okay. What you have to do and what we have to do is be realistic.
Mhm.
Um and you know, there's a temptation to over exaggerate abilities. There's also a temptation to shortchange our abilities, to go the other way.
Right.
There's a temptation to sit back and say, well, I just can't do anything because I'm just a one talent person.
Mhm.
It's like, well, maybe you're a one talent person, maybe you're not. The point of the parables is get busy.
Mhm.
That's the point.
Right.
But I do think it's easy to go both ways. It's
Mhm.
easy to say to look at ourselves and if we have a moment of pride, say, "Oh, I'm a five talent person."
Mhm.
Oh, maybe you are, maybe you're not. You might not be.
Mhm.
And then it's tempting to go the other way and say, "Oh, I just can't do anything." Yeah, you can. Go ahead, Rudy.
Just because you're a one talent individual, as it says, if you work at it and you make headway, you can
Right.
improve and become two, three, five, whatever you choose to do. So there's no guarantee that just because you are one, if you don't work, you'll never improve. And I think
Right.
that's even the message behind.
I
If you
think
give
so.
them interest, you can take a class, if
Mhm.
nothing else.
You can To those who have, more will be given. If you're faithful with a little, you'll be
Mhm.
entrusted with more. And I mean, we understand that simply. It's like if in talking about our abilities, how do you how do you gain more ability? It's like you use the ability you
Mhm.
have,
Right.
you work with it, you do what's pleasing to the Lord, and
Mhm.
you grow.
Right.
And as you grow, like to Rudy's point, this is how one talent people become two talent people, and two
Mhm.
talent people become five talent people. Now,
Mhm.
conversely, can five talent people become one talent people?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, that can happen too. Um, I'll tell a quick story. I knew a fella, and this is no joke. He was going through a rough patch in Arkansas. He was let go from a congregation. He was a preacher,
Mhm.
and I stopped him. He was 15, 20 years older than me, by the way. It was right after everything had blown up. I happened to be at a person's house and he was going out the back door, and I felt like I needed to say something
Mhm.
because of some of the things I'd heard that he was thinking about doing. Because what he was talking about doing was getting out of preaching.
Mhm.
And I asked him, I said, brother, I said, how many talents do you have? And his comment was, he said, well, I've always figured myself to be a five talent man.
Mhm.
And I said, you better not bury him. He
Mhm.
quit preaching for probably 5 or 6 years.
Mhm.
And he's preaching again, and I'm thankful for that. But
Mhm.
I was trying to encourage him And I think we all need to heed the warning. No one having put their hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the
Mm.
kingdom.
Right.
I know what Paul says, woe unto me if I don't do it. And
Mm.
it's like you better get busy with the talents you have, however many
Sure.
you have, because you can gain or you can lose.
Hmm.
To Rudy's point. Anyway, might think about just that idea. We can exaggerate our talents.
Hmm.
We can
Sure.
go the other way. We can
Right.
underestimate what we can do. Go ahead, Mark.
I heard a story once, because an accurate evaluation of our abilities is a valuable thing. And there was a farmer, and he was all of a sudden he was going to start preaching. And then someone asked him why he was doing that. He said, "Well, it was a sign from God. Up in the sky, it was letters were written, GP, and he knew it meant go preach." And the fellow said, "No, it said go plow." So, so maybe, but the point is, like you say, it's to be busy and engaged in,
Hmm.
useful activity and stewardship and so forth.
Yeah. Let me also say this. This is one of the passages where you go and you're trading with the talents.
Hmm.
There was there a risk that it may not work when you go and trade with something?
Sure.
There's a risk.
Mm.
So does that mean you just shouldn't trade? And, I knew you to be an austere man and I'm just going to go hide it? Because after all, it may not work out and I may lose
Right.
everything.
Sure.
Some people some people think that trading, which is what this parable's
Hmm.
talking about,
Right.
and investing in general, they think that it's gambling just because there's an element of risk to it.
Mm.
And it's not gambling.
Yeah.
Um, there is somewhat of a risk to it. But I guess one of the things I wanted to mention is it's okay to take a risk.
Mm.
Someone may have never someone may have never taught a class before.
Mm.
So does that mean they should never teach a class? Does that mean they should never teach a class because after all it might crash and burn?
Mm.
It's like no. It's like no, you try new things. That's how you
Right.
grow. You try things that you've never tried before, and that's how you learn new things.
Mm.
That's how you attempt new things, you learn, all anyway.
Mm.
You might think about that idea as well. One of the other questions I had that's not on the paper, and we've somewhat dealt with number four, but we may come back to it.
Mm.
So one of the common things that's said between the two, um, the one talent and the one mina man,
Mm.
reading from Matthew, New King James. And he says, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown. The Lord answers and he says, you knew that I reap where I have not sown, and you knew that I gather where I have not scattered seed. Luke's account says, I knew you to be an austere man. Let me flip over there. I knew you to be austere. The ESV uses the word severe.
Mm.
New American Standard uses the word demanding.
Mm.
So my question, and let me flip back over to this is so Luke 19, I think is where the New King James uses the word austere.
Mm.
Let me look just to make sure. Yeah. For I feared you because you are an austere man. And I have a reference. New King James has a reference, says severe.
Mm.
And the master says, you knew that I was an austere man.
Mm.
Now, that somewhat answers a question I was going to have because the question is the Lord severe? Again, ESV severe, New
Mm.
American Standard demanding, New King James austere. I think King James might be hard man in one of the places. So I think the master answers his own questions because the master says, you knew me to be a hard man.
Mm.
You knew me to be an austere man. So how is the Lord severe? What does it mean, and what is he talking about?
I would think the Lord is severe with us not doing what we are destined to do, which
Okay.
is being a Christian, which is preaching the gospel.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
he's exacting and holding to high standards.
He has expectations.
Mm.
And it's just as simple as that. What was the phrase you used, Mark? He holds us to high standards, or holding to high standards.
Oh, yeah.
Just as we're, talking about that, I'm thinking of, is it Romans chapter 11 where, it's talking about the kingdom and the tree and Gentiles grafted in and things like that. This is Romans chapter 11 at verse 22. Therefore, consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fell severity, but towards you goodness, if you continue in his goodness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. Does the potter not have power over the clay? And it's like he absolutely does. I think there's prophecies about the Messiah, about you will, the potter and the dashing to pieces. You'll rule them with a rod of iron and dash them to pieces. Something along those lines. But the Lord, and I will say, the Lord is severe, demanding, austere. The one talent person says, well, you reap where you have not sown.
Mm.
It's like, okay, the Lord has not sown. The Lord expects us to sow. But the Lord does supply the seed. And so it's like, yes, he is demanding, but he's also merciful. Um, both the 10 mina person and the 5 mina person were both accepted.
Mm.
The 5 talent person and the 2 talent person were both accepted.
Mm.
And if the 1 mina person and the 1 talent person, if they would have at least given it to the bankers, would the master have been pleased?
Sure.
Would it have been acceptable?
Sure.
Yes. The Lord is merciful. The Lord is gracious. But what the Lord can't handle is people who do nothing. That's that's what the Lord cannot handle. And so we have to we do have to get busy. Um, any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, go ahead, Rudy.
Well, sloth is one of the 7 deadly sins. And I think that's where you're calling out where you do nothing. Well, that's
Mm.
just laziness. That's sloth.
Sure.
All sins are deadly, by the way.
Yeah, but some, well, I can't say some more than others. They're all deadly.
The wages of sin is death, whether it's laziness or anything
Mm.
else. It's sad that the man was lazy,
Mm.
and yet he says, "I knew you to be an austere man."
Mm.
And it's like he knew it, and he says that he was afraid.
Mm.
And you think about, whenever I think of fear, I always think of Noah. Noah, who moved with godly fear for the saving of his household. What fear should do is it should drive us to get busy. And yet his fear, he was so afraid of losing it, it drove him just to bury it.
Mm.
Um, and it's just a sad thing that someone can fear the Lord and yet not do what they're supposed to do. They don't have godly fear. It may speak more to that different types of fear and things like that, perhaps. We have a couple minutes left. Anyone have any other thoughts or comments?
Well, I would just think that the last lazy servant shows really a pew warmer. It's about it. Someone that comes once a week, comes in, goes, and that's it.
And I will say, remember what these two parables are about. They didn't know when the Lord was going to return.
Mm-hmm.
And when you don't know when the master is going to call for an
Mm-hmm.
accounting, what do you think? I'll have more time.
I got a lot of time. Yeah.
I'll have more time. How many people at Judgment Day are going to think, I thought I had more time? And it's like, you don't know. You don't know. Any other thoughts? Go ahead. Bruce, were you going to say
Yeah,
something?
I was
Yeah.
going to say that's one of the devil's best weapons. Is you got plenty of time.
Yeah.
You don't have to do. You
Yeah.
don't have to do it today.
Yeah. Behold, today is the day of salvation.
Mhm.
Yep. Those who know to do good and do not do it, to them it is sin. The one talent man knew to do good and he did not do it. Anything else? All right. Appreciate y'all being on here this evening. Hope it's been helpful for you. Everyone take care. Have a safe week. Hope to see you Wednesday night.
Okay, John. Have a good one.
See y'all.